Hello, today I'm going to go over the reading response course, a chemistry course, a math course, and all these things. And do they kind of communicate with each other? Does that knowledge transfer across the various different academic discourse communities that you're kind of forced to kind of be a part of in an academic setting and further on in your professional career? All right. So then Carter goes in to argue that he wants to talk about that disciplines do not have separate divisions of declarative knowledge, right? Instead, they may be seen as based on ways of doing and ways of knowing and writing, modes of inquiry, rather than static territories of knowledge, right? So this just goes along again with Carter's main argument throughout the entire article, is that rather being separate divisions of kind of theoretical or empirical or whatever type of knowledge base a discipline has, being a separate division, a separate college, a separate kind of like castle, if you will. And certainly we could play around with some Game of Thrones kind of analogies here about if like everybody could just start talking and getting along rather than everybody wanting to take over the throne, right? The Iron Throne, then maybe all of this crap wouldn't have happened. But Carter's really kind of trying to say something similar, that like we should not be so divided, we should not be so separate, we should start to see the similarities of ways of knowing, of ways of doing, of ways of thinking, and start thinking about disciplines as meta-disciplines, disciplines that have various levels of engagement, various levels of activities, various levels of expertise and membership, and often meta-disciplines, meaning that nurses should and could be communicating with people who are in psychology to consider beyond just the human body, but the mind of the patient, right? Or nurses and their own stress factors and anxiety levels and overworking kind of conditions that then impacts them in the ways that they can and are able to do their job when they're overworked, overstressed, and so forth. So kind of integrating some of these meta-disciplines that do similar work, think about similar topics, conduct similar research, and write in similar ways, opens up a much larger forum for communicative practices for furtherance of activity, knowledge, and goals, right? And then Carter also argues that in order to demonstrate our knowledge, we must be able to communicate that knowledge, specifically through writing. And so what he's trying to say then is that, you know, one thing that often happens, and we can see this happening quite often in, say, like some of our lit and English fields, in which you have a very small group of individuals who are researching, say, for instance, for my master's dissertation, researched a woman who did Gothic novels in the late 18th century. And I would say there's probably 6 people who knew of and or write about, you know, her work. And so that conversation, that knowledge is very limited, right? And doesn't seem to be very applicable or useful in the grand scheme of things. And so what Carter wants to do is convince that disciplines can be meta, that they can work together, especially when they have very similar conversations, knowledge, writing practices, and so forth. And that the only way that we can demonstrate our knowledge or communicate our knowledge is through writing, that communication of the thing that we do, of what is important. And the larger the audience is, the more readership, the more engagement, and the more ability to kind of impact that discourse community and beyond to produce innovations, you know, wider audiences and readership, and so forth. Finally, to wrap it up, Carter argues that there is an overlap not only between the disciplines and meta-disciplines, but between what was often thought as rather disparate disciplines. And so here he goes into these kind of categories where he's made up, instead of like academic colleges or academic fields, he's broken up what he sees as the major colleges within a university and placed them into categories of knowing, categories of research, and, you know, categories of how one uses or privileges the type of information that they're exploring. And so the first is empirical inquiry, which means answering questions by drawing conclusions from systematic investigation based on empirical data, right? And so what he talks about here is any type of discipline or discourse community that looks at research through observational skills, the use of experiments to collect data, the use of organization and summarization of data, both in verbal and graphic forms, and then the interpretation of that data to draw conclusions that allows one to support or refute hypotheses. Okay, so we can see a lot of different discourse communities that can fall into that category. And in fact, rhetoric and composition, if you get into the tech communications or the kind of like the computer science component of rhetoric and composition, or even my dissertation, which was a mixed method study that had hypotheses and did have charts and graphs and statistics and so forth, you can start to see some of the similarities in the ability to communicate and see the world in very similar lenses, right? And so he's asking for academic discourse communities to start to place themselves into these wider categories: empirical inquiry, research from sources. Now, certainly this is one in which you'll find a lot of people from the humanities, philosophy, art history, English, but you're still going to find people that do this in psychology, that do this in social work, that does this in kind of global exploration and so forth. But here, their focus when it comes to knowledge and what they find is important with knowledge is looking at sources that have their origins elsewhere, which is secondary research, right? Whereas in the first category, in empirical, primarily they find their information through primary research, which is going into the lab and doing the thing and publishing about it, or going and exploring, so an archaeological site and the results from that dig and so forth, or case studies of students within a variety of different classroom settings and so forth, right? So the actual going and doing the thing and writing those up rather than looking at past research that has already been published, that has already been discussed, going years and years and years back to look at sources and archival work and so forth. This is research from sources. And then performance, which is the act and result of a performance, but particularly to the primary of the object is evidence of success in learning to perform, or the act of doing the performance. And so we, of course, can see a lot of this in kind of kinesthesiology and dance and theater and music and art and so on and so forth. But again, there are disciplines that have hybrids of this or integrate performance. Certainly, teaching is one of those. We always need to be able to get in front of individuals to perform. But even in the field of business, this idea of having to act and to present and to integrate a variety of different performance moves in order to get the product sold or to get the client to come to our advertisement business or whatever it may be. So you can see the overlap between a variety of different academic discourse communities, but in essence, this is what Carter is trying to argue for, to have us look at academic discourse communities and these categories rather as being these very separate, disparate, many kind of categories that never speak with each other and never communicate, because it's silly, because a lot of us are doing similar work or thinking about knowledge in very similar frameworks, and we should start to be collaborating with each other. So I hope this helps. It's very dense, right? But if you can kind of think about Carter's argument in this way, then I think it helps you as you explore your discourse community, the work that you've done to get to the point that you are right now, and what you're going to continue to do in order to build yourself as a very diverse and very multi-layered academic and researcher. Thanks, guys, and I will talk to you soon.